When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back. So we're going to be kind of continuing on this kind of series that I've been kind of doing and looking at what George R.R. Martin does and how he implements it into A Song of Ice and Fire. How does he write? And specifically in today's video, and this might be like a two-parter, I'm not sure how long this one's going to be, but we're going to be talking about how George writes love. And by love, I don't mean just romantic love, I mean love for one's children, love for this or that. And we're going to be looking at a lot of situations in which George is trying to actually tell a story or a message through these characters. So, for instance, if we look at certain characters like Catelyn, who is driven by quite a lot of love, she is driven by the love of her children a lot of the times, and that causes her to make bad decisions. So we're going to go through certain things like that, where it's like a family type love. And then we're also going to go through some other situations of love, like Jon and Ygritte and that kind of forbidden love type thing. And we also may also look at how George explains lust. And that's going to be an interesting topic to talk about as well. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow. Rich Pill might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So like I was talking about earlier, I want to talk about the idea of family love first, because it's such a major theme of the story. And when I'm talking about family love, we're also going to talk about the lack of family love and how that impacts our characters, how love is at the very central theme of everything that happens in the story. If we look at Catelyn, so Catelyn is this character that I've always talked about, especially in my rereads, when it has nothing to do, when she has nothing going on that's impacting her when it comes to emotional state and the love of her family, she actually acts quite rationally. Whether you look at her being like this mediator between Stannis and Renly, she's fairly rational. She's kind of the voice of reason. But when you look at a lot of her other actions, her capturing Tyrion is kind of an emotional response to finding out some information from Littlefinger that she just kind of takes for the truth. She doesn't have any evidence, no proof. And that kind of comes from an emotional reaction of what she thinks happens to Bran, and that somebody tried to kill her child. And that also will impact her other children as well. So that is, again, an emotional, loving response to her child. If we see how Catelyn looks at her children as well with like Robb, for instance, she deeply loves him. And we even see that no matter what you think of Stoneheart, that is kind of the personification that she loved Robb, and that death broke her emotionally. Grief is something that is different for every single person. Now, Stoneheart isn't Catelyn really anymore, but she still has aspects of Catelyn. And again, when we look at her love for, say, her daughters, Arya and Sansa, she is willing to trade Jaime Lannister for them. And an outsider's point of view looking at this and goes, this is entirely irrational. And something I've talked about, I've done a comparison on how this is done in the show on releasing Jaime compared to the books. In the books, it's much more, the central theme here is love. The idea that Catelyn loves her children and does not want them to be prisoners, doesn't want them to be basically a prisoner of war. And she's willing to make some shot in the dark. If this is the one hope that she can get back her daughters, so be it. And that's another emotional response to Ned's death. She doesn't want to lose more people in her family that she loves. And that's very interesting because she's going to release Jaime Lannister, who is a far more valuable hostage than both of her daughters. Presumably they even have them. She doesn't have concrete knowledge that they're even there. She knows that Sansa is, but nobody's really said anything about Arya. And when we look at that, and we look at what steps she's taking to then secure that, she has the word of Tyrion, more or less, who, again, is not the most popular person in the world. So you see how, from an outsider's point of view, it's like, why is she doing this? And George is trying to tell us and give us a message that love, when you're emotional and it's involving people you love, a lot of times you will act irrational. And that's why I think a lot of people see, for instance, a therapist. A therapist can be very helpful. A therapist is not involved in anything going on in your life and can look at it from somewhat of an objective point of view. Hopefully they don't have like an agenda or personal bias that would kind of lean you to choose this or that. But that is kind of the idea of kind of a therapist. They're an objective point of view that can give you advice and help you figure out what your problems are, or this or that. And that's kind of what George is giving us as spectators of these people. We're seeing their decisions, and they don't seem rational until you kind of look through their eyes. And that's what makes his characters so interesting. If we look at some other instances of this, let's look at kind of a lack of love. So Tyrion is a character that does not get really any love from his family outside of Jaime. And what does that do? Tyrion feels this void, right, of acceptance, where he hasn't been given any gratitude by his father. He's always searching for that, it feels like. Where the Battle of the Blackwater, he's expecting his father to be very proud of him. And if we even look at, like, say, Tyrion being named the Hand of the King, that wasn't out of a sign of love. It was more that Tyrion is a Lannister and Tywin is using him. It's not because of that family trust and love type thing. That's not existent. Tywin was desperate at that point, and he saw Tyrion for what he was, a pawn that he could use. And we see that this lack of love shows that Tywin does not care about Tyrion. Tywin is fine with just having Tyrion die or being sent to the wall. It gets him out of his hair. It's a stain on Tywin's legacy. Now, with that being said, Tyrion does represent the Lannisters. So he can't have people, for instance, like Catelyn taking Tyrion, because that looks bad. That means you can take things from the Lannisters and not pay your, debts, where Tywin doesn't pay that back. So we see that lack of love leads Tyrion down this dark road, and it's not helpful that Cersei also goes along with it. And it makes Tyrion go down some not great habits. And we even see Tywin, that if Tywin had loved his children more and actually treated them well, how different things could have been. How different Cersei could have been if Tywin had actually been more of a father to her. So that lack of love is also another instrument that George uses in his writing to show that, yes, family love is a great thing, but also can have its repercussions when it comes to critical choices. But so can neglectfulness. So can a absence of love be very damaging to a person. And that gets us into the next part of that. Let's go to another example. We talked about Stannis and Renly earlier on. Let's look at Stannis as a character. He's another character that doesn't really have love. He is this character that loses his parents very early on, and he kind of feels like this character that is never the same after that moment when his parents die in front of him, basically. He is this character devoid of happiness, really. He does not laugh. He is a character that feels like was never really loved. His brother doesn't particularly love him, and Robert really even says that. And he looks at Ned more as a brother than Stannis. So Stannis is another character that a lot of what his personality is built upon is because of past traumas and the lack of love that he gets. Even his relationship with Selyse is not a good one, right? Like, it's not a good marriage. He doesn't love her. There's no love there. And that's another point of showing that Stannis has no enjoyment in his life. And that's an interesting character dynamic. So let's move kind of away from the family aspect of it. We could go on for years talking about the family love repercussions, or maybe even lack thereof, family love that could lead to other things. We could be talking about that forever. Let's look at more of a romantic love situation. And George R.R. Martin kind of plays into this idea of kind of a Renaissance Italy, or more like a medieval way of looking at love, where a woman can not basically be despoiled. If this woman has lost her maidenhead and she's not a virgin anymore, she is basically discarded in this society because it is seen as very holy to be a virgin. Now, if you flip that around, it doesn't matter with men. So that is an exact comparison to history that George R.R. Martin does. And it's a really interesting way of telling that story, really, because we see how many times it impacts the story. And we see that love is something that George kind of is trying to tell us and make an argument, right, of you don't choose who you love. And that's an interesting point. Now, I think incest is wrong. But that kind of is what George plays on with Jaime and Cersei to a degree. And what I love about what he shows about love is we see like the kind of good relationships of love, like with like Catelyn and Ned, I'd say is a healthy relationship at times. You can look into some things and think, not so good. And then you also will have, relationship like Jon and Ygritte, which is like a very fun loving, like they seem really good for each other, but it's not meant to be type of forbidden love. You have all of that in George R.R. Martin's work. You have the terrible marriages, the abusive relationships like Robert and Cersei, a very, very abusive and fucked up relationship. We see other messed up ones about how women were being married off very young with Sansa and Tyrion. What George does is shows that women in this world specifically didn't really have a lot of rights when it came to who do you get to choose to marry? What is your role in society? Because for the most part, women got their power through their husbands. And this is something I learned a lot about, especially I took a history of Renaissance class, and it's very similar to the way A Song of Ice and Fire is detailed and how relationships work. And the idea here is, if you even think about some of the most powerful, say, women in A Song of Ice and Fire, a lot of them kind of get their power because of their husbands, but they are able to use that. So if we look at, for instance, characters in the main story, Dany is a character that inherently has all of her power through Drogo, because when Drogo dies, Dany really in the Dothraki's eye is pretty much nothing. She should go to the Dosh Khaleen, and she doesn't have power anymore. Now Dany doesn't follow that, and she does her own thing, but that's kind of the societal standard. So if we look at Queen Alysanne, which is probably one of the most powerful women and influential women in all of A Song of Ice and Fire history, she had her power because she was married to Jaehaerys. So you see that societal imbalance between men and women. And Cersei is a character that really represents kind of that entire ideal with how she tries to hold herself, where she talks about or thinks about if she had been born a man, things would be much different. But because, she doesn't have a cock, she is not looked upon the same as, say, a person like Jaime or Tywin. That's a very interesting idea that George plays on in the story. And we also look at this idea that's very prevalent in, like, Jon, and I think Jon and Robb's plotline specifically, where love and duty. How do you deal with that? Because like I talked about with Jon and Ygritte, they kind of have a forbidden love. And I don't think anybody could really blame Jon if he had actually just run away with Ygritte. They lived in a cave, they'd done whatever. That's a happy ending for Jon. I mean, not happy for the rest of us because Jon's a very pivotal player in really the fate of Westeros as a whole. But could you have blamed him? He chooses love over duty or honor. And he doesn't choose that because that's not who Jon is. And Jon goes back to the wall. And because of that decision, because of duty and choosing to uphold his vows, Ygritte dies. It's that really interesting way that George puts a spin on that. But sometimes you have to choose between those. And Robb is another character that's very interesting because I don't think Robb's was more of a love for Jane. It was more of an honor thing and honor/duty thing. And, he sleeps with Jane in a moment of weakness. He's been injured in the Westerlands. And he decides to marry Jane. And again, it's kind of the idea of love over duty, because his duty was to marry a Frey girl. But because of love/lust, his duty is a little morally muddy, and he marries Jane Westerling. And we see how that impacts negatively, as that is what inevitably kind of leads to his death. There's some other factors that lead to that as well, but that's one of those major things. Another thing, if we get even further into the main story, look at Dany and the idea of love and lust. Dany is forced to marry Hisdar. That's not out of love. That's more of just a relationship to try and help the city unite them. And it's more political. It's not really any type of love or even lust. Dario is a character that is just blatantly pretty much lust for Dany. It's not a character that she's in love with. It's just a character that she has a lot of lust for. There's a lot of characters that come to Dany seeking her hand, whether it's out of love, whether it's political, whether it's both. And that's the interesting part that George tries to play on. What I think is very interesting with Dany is George switches the roles. In any normal society in this world, it's the women trying to marry the man. It's not the man trying to marry this woman usually. It's a very interesting play on that idea. And what George, I think, does so well in this story is he kind of gives us time to think about that idea of love over honor. Can you have both of them, right? Can you have both at the same time because of how many bad relationships we see in A Song of Ice and Fire? And what George, at the heart of it, is kind of, I feel like, trying to tell us, specifically with like gender roles, basically with like the women and the men in the society, is this idea that you can't really have a good couple. It's a very low percentage, but only really one party is the one consenting and making all the power over the other. That's kind of how it goes. I mean, you have these relationships that, you know, do work, but how many relationships do we see that just fail, that do not work and are terrible? And that has massive repercussions on A Song of Ice and Fire. Think about how many, you know, times we get the Targaryens, right? Where you just have marriages that don't work. And because they don't work, it can cause major issues. And you just look at other things that go on with like birthing and stuff like that. It's a mess, right? And I think it's a very interesting topic to look at that George does do. And even think about love that's not reciprocated. Littlefinger is a character that, yes, he has other motivations, but part of that, his motivations are love for Catelyn. And what does he do because he loves Catelyn? He duels Brandon Stark. This kickstarts all of Littlefinger's actions later on in the story. And that motivation is still present there, as that love has kind of been weirdly passed on to Catelyn's daughter, Sansa. So again, we see how even, not even like the lack of love, but the denial of love from someone else, how far that can go. Think about Victarion, who is a character that is traumatized by his last wife because of what Euron does to his wife. Think about how that traumatized him. And I know Victarion is a very messed up individual, but think about how that has impacted him as a character overall. And it just, you can go really and talk about any single character in the story, and one way or another, love or lack of love and how that relates to honor and duty is present. Think about Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion is a character that we talked about how his family didn't love him, but let's look at even his relationship with Tysha, where that was a genuine love. But because of other things pulling that away, lies that were told, it's a love that, unfortunately for Tyrion, never happens again. And it's something that has traumatized and haunted him to this day. It's very interesting to see the way that those play into how Tyrion views the world as a whole. But thank you guys all for watching this video. If you guys want like a part 2 on love in A Song of Ice and Fire, let me know. But if not, I will move on. Let me know what your guys' topics are. Also, if you guys did comment any topics in the last video I did talking about kind of George R.R. Martin's writing, sorry I haven't like probably looked at them yet because I'm recording these in advance because I'm going to be out of town. But yeah, thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.